Hi everyone. If you are fortunate enough not to have encountered me before, I'm Paul. I have been doing this for way too long, which probably now qualifies me as an official internet old fart. I started out doing stuff in the UK internet arena when I was at uni in sort of like early to mid-90s, when I worked for a company that did dial-up store and forward email, which was really old school, using lovely technologies like X400. I then progressed to working at PSINet shortly after they acquired EUnet in the UK in 1996. Spent a year and a half working as the first network engineer at the Link, so that's the second time they've been mentioned today. I hope someone's not keeping count. They get mentioned in here again, I'm so sorry. I then went back to PSINet to build a couple of data centers and did consultancy for the next 20 odd years until, because clearly it was the rage a few years ago, got involved in an altnet, so I'm currently doing consultancy. I'm CTO of Lightning Fiber, and I work with an outfit called IDS, all three of whom I'm happy to say are LONAP members. So without further ado, some of you might have seen parts of this before. It's been sort of twisted and merged to make this executive 25th birthday edition. So following on a bit from some of the things Rob said, which was entertaining, but I don't have Tony Blair loading Number 10's website, thankfully. What did infrastructure look like back then? What were we building? What were we selling? What did technology look like? Did it work? Sort of, actually. Surprisingly well sometimes. And how did LONAP come to be as a result of all this stuff? Back in 1997, I had less grey hair. I needed a haircut then, I need a haircut now, so some things definitely are the same. The other thing you couldn't do, that you could do in 1997 that you certainly can't do now, is wander up onto the roof of Telly House and admire the view. That's my colleague Doug, who I've worked with for a long time, who now works with me again. He will be very cross to see a picture of him and a jar of Marmite on the Telly House roof. Again, back in 97, we had archive data, and we stored it in lots of strange ways that nobody has drives for anymore. That's a Jazz drive and a couple of DAT DDS tapes. There's actually a serious message in this, because whilst I had the media itself, you put said media into a nicely head-cleaned drive, and it whirs away for about 48 seconds and goes shan't. One of the things that I've sort of learnt while getting some of this data together for these sort of presentations is the only things that have been reliable are, well, up till SSD era, spinning disks. A good, Seagate Barracuda or Hawk from this era is still going strong now. It may only be SCSI 1 and it might be as slow as heck, but it will remember your data. Unlike the write-only memory we see there. So, moving on to more interesting things. That line's from L.P. Hartley's novel, The Go-Between. But it's interesting to see what's changed and actually what still feels quite familiar. Infrastructure-wise, 25 years ago, it was pretty London-centric. As Rob said, Telly House East was being built. Telly House North was the predominant place to go, but it was still full of a lot of dealing room disaster recovery, which was its raison d'etre in the first place. Telly House Metro came on the scene in 97, and the Telly City Mill Harbour, or Red Bus Interhouse building as it was then, was online in 98. Manchester had the original Telly City building, which, as I wrote this, I couldn't remember whether it was Williams or Kilburn, so just didn't put either in because I'd have got it wrong. And there were some provider-specific facilities, obviously things like ULCC, universities had things, but the data centres, kind of as we know them today, the massive Equinixes, etc., absolutely weren't there. You might think that the bigger massive data centres now would drive prices down, but Equinix have done their hardest to do the opposite. And connecting-wise, internationally, there were the big US Meet Me buildings that people sort of know and love today. There were the original IXPs, May East and May West. May East was Washington, D.C., came online in 1992. May West a couple of years later in San Jose. And they were the predominant interconnect points for the entire world, pre sort of 95-ish. A number of university-based facilities in Europe were used for hosting. SARA and NICAF are obvious examples, and they housed key POP and interconnect locations. As I said, modern data centers were definitely still to appear. Connectivity-wise, similar to now, actually. Everything was slower, everything was more expensive. You used a carrier circuit from your national telco. If you were lucky enough, there might be some competing telcos. So in the UK, we had a lot of fibre companies that were gobbled up by Telewest, then Virgin Media around these times. If you could get it and you could afford the offensively expensive gear to put on the end, dark fibre was fantastic. I've got here in the notes, a Sprint T1 from Seattle to London was offered to one of my colleagues in 1995 for the very reasonable sum of £1.2 million a year. A T1 is 1.5 megs. They added to the quote, delivered anywhere in the UK for no extra charge. Well, that's really generous of them at that price. The other thing to note is that a lot of this was SDH-based. Ethernet and IP were still to win the I am the default layer 2 and I am the default layer 3 protocol. So you would see technologies such as FIDI, and still Token Ring was out there, proprietary physical networking technology like AppleTalk, and other protocols, so IPX, obviously NetBUI if you were unfortunate enough to have to drive that in a Windows network. As Rob showed, the connect to the internet, IP was kind of in the stack, but it was very much a bolt-on afterthought at this point. Windows machines would prefer any other protocol usually. We had obviously the European IXPs, Lynx, AMSIX, DEKIX, NetNod. The AMSIX pricing and members. So AMSIX had 26 members in October 97. Lynx had 35 members in October 97. So this was around the time when LONAP was actually starting to come into being. The AMSIX costs I've got from there was €500 a month for 10 meg. So put that one into perspective. The connections were very much router-to-router technology. Some enterprising companies had either ATM or frame relay backbones at layer 2, but a lot of this was just daisy-chained routers and trace routes that had lots of hops, and certainly in the mid-1990s, this was all CPU switched and routed. This was not, hardware flow-based routing at all yet. So I've got a couple of diagrams here. One is the PIPEX network from March 94. The other one is PSINet's network from 1996, I think it is. You can't see those very well, but what they actually show is national backbones at 2 meg, 4 meg, maybe the odd 8 meg in there, and a lot of the regional connections are just at multiples of 64K, maybe 128, 256K. The PSINet one shows 10 meg to the US, 1 meg to Amsterdam. PIPEX a couple of years earlier, 768K to the US, 128K to Sweden. So we're talking lots of low bandwidths, but that was fine for the time. A quick look at what the Lynx was doing. So October 98, Lynx had made it to 53 members. 300 megasecond traffic in early 98. There's a sort of steady growing up to the left graph with a gap with broken monitoring. I suspect that was my fault. And you got, if you were at the Lynx and you peered with anybody and everybody, which of course wasn't the case, and root servers were a long way in the future at this point, you would get about 16% of the routing table, 9,000 routes out of a global table of a laughably low 55,000. So you didn't have problems of nearly 1 million routes back then, certainly, which is just as well, given that Cisco 2501s were being used. Scaling was a challenge. Lots of hardware and software was bleeding edge. Everyone wanted more for less. Internet exchange points especially really caused some stretching problems. Basically, what we would now refer to as lots of east-west flows, the switch vendors at the time, certainly Catalyst 5000s, really handled badly. They liked the idea of you're an office or a work group switch, you've got lots of clients, and there's a big server or something else, and it's predominantly north-south tree-based flows. we had no end of trouble with hardware trying to make it do what we wanted. But customers back then, when you consider what they were paying, because a lot of these customers are business customers on lease lines, were very, very, very accommodating. So product-wise, as Rob has said, ADSL was in its infancy in some trials, but pretty much people were using lease lines if you're a business. If you're a business, you might have ISDN dial-up, or you had just normal modem dial-up. There were some interesting other oddballs, such as Usenet News, which was a great bandwidth hog, and we had UUCP to deliver email, or sometimes IP if you were enlightened enough. I'm sure that some enterprising salesman tried to sell internet over UUCP to somebody. That was a really bizarre storm-forward dial-up technology that thankfully doesn't really get used anymore. Some people offered just Unix shell access on servers as well. If you had a lease line, you would typically have an NTE serial device that would plug into a router like that, Cisco 2501, and pretty typical setup for the providers of the day. And for a lot of them, that's what you'd have at the POP end as well. If you didn't have any layer 2 switching or ATM or frame relay, you'd have a stack of those at the POP, probably with a 10-base-2 load of Ethernet up the back acting as a backbone, and that would be how your customers connected to you. There was no real dual homing as we know it now, like a customer might be dual home with BGP. These would pretty much use RIP v1 to get a default route and announce RIP v1 customer routes back. Some of this was pre-CIDR, so even if you wanted 2 or 3 IP addresses, you got a /24, and I know of at least 1 or 2 EUNet customers where they needed more than 256, where there was a /16 going to an ISDN customer. One of the challenges was that BT eventually would aggregate these 64K circuits onto bearers, which if you had some kind of switching technology in the way was fantastic. You delivered it between your switch and your POP router on HISI, high-speed serial interface, where high speed means 54 meg. But that was pretty high speed at the time. The problem was, because they wouldn't aggregate on more than 2 meg, you ended up with delights like this in Telehouse. Each one of those coax pairs was a 2 meg customer or an aggregate of a bunch of customers. Doing anything in there was generally bad for customer uptime. Web hosting had its own bits of fun and games for these people, like Tony Blair, who wanted a website. It was all pretty much shared web servers. You know, in this era, there was some dedicated stuff. Obviously, big people like the BBC had their own suites of things, but for your average website, it was shared. There was no HTTP 1.1, which meant one site per IP address, which meant lots of loopback IPs on the same server, a bit like we had to do for SSL a few years later. But there was no HTTPS in these days yet either. Apache was in its infancy. It was a year or 2 old, still had some issues. The old NCSA web server was pretty much the dominant at this point. SSH was still very new and subjected to export controls where the US government still thought it was a cruise missile. This meant that you ended up having to use things like TCP wrappers to protect your servers because host-based firewalls that were stateful weren't really a thing either. And you had to use one-time passwords over Telnet because nothing was encrypted. And we had the joys of websites that said best viewed in Internet Explorer version X or best viewed in Netscape Navigator version Y. Thankfully, that's now a thing of the past, hopefully. So, moving on to the exchanges, because that's why we're all here. At the time, and people in this room will remember this, the links joining process was interesting. Basically, in a cartel-like manner, which would never really fly today, you had to provide 3 trace routes to the Internet's root name servers, excluding K, that didn't go through an existing links member's connectivity. What this basically meant is you had to have an IP connection to somewhere outside the country, typically the States. This excluded the content providers and the smaller ISPs, who were essentially behind the UK tier 1s, who were links members, and anybody who didn't have international connectivity. This was trivially circumvented, and some enterprising links members, whilst simultaneously banging the drum about we mustn't allow people in who can't do the trace routes, were selling 64K clear channel connections to New York just so that you could do the trace route, and you didn't send any traffic that way, of course. But this problem basically led, in part, to the formation of LONAP. where LONAP arose from was the demise of iExchange, which was operated initially by a company called OnNet, who was run by a colourful character who, if you'd encountered him, you will know exactly what I mean, and we'll move on from there because it's being recorded. There were many allegations of interesting things done. Serbernet and Nildrum, who were connected to iExchange, along with RedNet and FTech, essentially got together saying, what are we going to do? We can't join links right now. We need to get connectivity. We've got this defunct exchange. Let's make use of it. So the service, using an initial Cisco switch, was live by December 1997. So this was it was kind of operating before incorporation, and was formally incorporated in March 1998. There was, back in those days, and being a Lynx employee at the time, I remember this from the Lynx side, so wasn't really involved in the barroom chat on the LONAP side, a degree of animosity between the bigger players at the Lynx and the LONAP members, especially the sort of the founding members. I'm very happy to say that went away quite quickly, and Lynx and LONAP work much more harmoniously. And once the three trace routes rule was dropped, mid-1998, the original LONAP founding members joined the Lynx too. And wearing my hat as a provider who is present at both exchanges, I actually value both the technical diversity of being at Lynx and LONAP and the operational diversity that having two organisations brings. So from that perspective, it's really good for us that we've got two thriving operational IXPs in London. Why is that not moving forward? I've broken it already. The BBC were having an interesting time joining the Lynx. Interesting sums up much fun and games. LONAP, of course, were very happy to have them as members until the Lynx saw sense. They joined in September 99, just in time for the millennium. This did lead, though, to LONAP needing a bit of a kit upgrade, and upgraded to some Cisco 3524 XLs that could do 1 gig. This is high speed now. We had the old-fashioned GBICs and what have you, those great big slots. But that also opened up multi-site because you could quite cheaply with dark fibre drive for 10 kilometres at 1 gig, much like we all these days just drive with 10 gig or 100 gig ZR optics. As I said, it was all just slower and more expensive. The clicky is not working. So by late 2000, LONAP's made it up to 25 members, gaining at quite a rate in the early 2000s. Membership was 45 by 2005. I think I joined with PRT hat somewhere around 2002, 2003-ish. 10 gig ports became available in mid-2005. Traffic levels and the membership continued to grow over the next 18 years to the 254 members and the more than 1 terabit of aggregate traffic that we see today. I failed dismally in my one task of finding some interesting snippets of LONAP bandwidth graphs from these early eras. There's 3 reasons for this. One, some of it was before exchanges typically calculated and published aggregate statistics. 2, because I couldn't steal anybody else's presentations to actually find them because they weren't there. And 3, because the Wayback Machine seems to archive dynamically generated content, especially IXP graphs, in a particularly bizarre way, in that I kept getting the same graph and going, I don't think that LONAP had this much traffic with 5 members back in 1997. So with apologies for not having lots of up and to the right traffic graphs, are there any questions? Oh, and that's the nice old original logo, because we have to show original logos. I've bored you all to tears. Thank you.